Every single stroke of color can change the entire destiny of a canvas. Today, a friend of mine will explain it to you.
We're dropping you right into the darkest, most tragic climax of art history today. We're not starting with the vibrant sunflowers or the beautiful starry skies. No, we begin right at the devastating end. Today, in this explainer, we're dissecting the final days, the unraveling mind, and the agonizing irony of Vincent van Gogh. We are going to see exactly how absolute genius collided head-on with absolute destruction.
I want you to really think about this for a second. What actually happens to a human mind that endures too much light, too much color, and just way too much pain? For Van Gogh, the world was this overwhelming sensory explosion that he desperately tried to capture on canvas. But that very effort, it slowly tore his psyche apart. We're going to dive into the visceral, gritty reality of a brain entirely shattered by its own magnificent vision.
Picture this. It's dusk in the quiet fields of Auvers in July 1890. The wheat fields are dead silent, save for the rustling wind that Vincent had painted so obsessively. Suddenly, a lonely, exhausted man staggers out of that golden sea. He's holding a pistol. He has a fatal gunshot wound to his chest. This right here is the harrowing opening to the final chapter of a life defined by a relentless, consuming fire.
Let's look at how that final day actually unfolded, as the noose just tightened around him. According to the memoirs of Adeline Ravoux, Vincent left the inn that morning with his easel, just like any other day. But in the afternoon, out in the shadow of the local chateau, he shot himself. And then, at 9 p.m., he quietly returned to the inn, walking bent over, holding his stomach, and retreated into the pitch black of his tiny rented attic room.
When the innkeeper, Father Ravoux, heard groans and rushed upstairs, he found Vincent curled up in this crooked position on his bed. Father Ravoux panicked, crying out, asking what on earth he had done. And Vincent just delivered this chilling, straightforward confession, "I have tried to kill myself." There was no panic, no frenzy in this moment, just the heavy, crushing exhaustion of a man who literally could no longer bear the weight of being alive.
But what's absolutely fascinating is how he reacted the next morning. Even while he was bleeding out, he maintained this tragic sense of dignity. When the local gendarme rudely interrogated him, Vincent protected everyone else to his very last breath. He looked the police in the eye and insisted his destruction was his alone. His body was his own. He was claiming ultimate autonomy over his own tragic end.
Now, to truly understand the silence of that wheat field, we actually have to step back in time. We need to go back to the fire that burned him alive during his time in the south of France, in Arles. From February 1888 to May 1889, he experienced this frenzied, almost hypnotic productivity, but it was also the exact site of his terrifying mental fracturing. Look at this stark contrast. It's jarring. On one hand, he was producing hundreds of the most vivid, manic masterpieces the world has ever seen. But on the other hand, the severe human cost. He was suffering through intense bouts of mania, depression, and creeping paranoia. The vivid colors on his canvases were literally bleeding directly from a psyche that was buckling under immense pressure. So we need to completely strip away the romanticized, almost cartoonish legend of the severed ear. As recent forensic research reveals, this was definitely not the quirky act of some passionate artist. It was a violent, desperate cry of a brain tearing itself apart in a moment of acute psychological trauma. It's clinical and it's agonizing. Here's how that chaotic night of December 23, 1888 actually played out. It was triggered by a massive argument with his idol and housemate Paul Gauguin. When Gauguin walked out, threatening to abandon him, Vincent's intense fear of isolation triggered a profound psychological break. He took a razor, severed his ear, wrapped it in cloth, and in a state of complete disorientation, dropped it off at a local brothel. It was the tragic collapse of a mind so desperate for connection, but fundamentally unable to sustain it.
The immediate fallout from that night was brutal. Ordinary society didn't look at him and see a visionary. They saw a madman. The residents of Arles were so terrified of his erratic behavior that they actually drafted a legal petition to have him removed from the town. He was profoundly alienated, just a complete outcast, carrying the crushing burden of a vision literally no one else could see.
0. Let that number sink in for a second. This represents the amount of paintings he was effectively able to sell to sustain himself during his lifetime. Sure, he may have sold one or exchanged a few with friends, but 0 is the harsh reality of his financial survival. His groundbreaking work, which sells for tens of millions today, was considered utterly worthless by the very society he lived in.
And because of that, he wasn't just a poor artist. He willingly starved himself for his work. He actively prioritized buying expensive paints, canvases, and paying his models, even feeding those models, over his own physical survival. He literally ran his body into the ground, surviving on a diet of stale bread, coffee, tobacco, and just pure self-destructive willpower.
3.50. That is the staggeringly meager amount in francs he paid per night for his tiny, suffocating attic room at the Auberge Revue at the end of his life. He was living essentially like a monk. He stripped away every single worldly comfort just so he could funnel every last drop of his resources and energy into his art.
But here is the emotional core of this whole story. Behind every single stroke of paint was the agonizing reality of how those paints were actually bought. A reality that relied entirely on his deeply complicated, codependent bond with his brother Theo. Just look at this dynamic. It's heartbreaking. Theo is up in Paris, working tirelessly as an art dealer, newly married, raising an infant son. And Vincent is out in the countryside, completely financially dependent, battling severe mental illness, and acting as a constant drain on his brother's wallet. The letters between them make it so clear. Vincent felt that his sheer existence was an unforgivable burden.
Listen to this line from a letter he sent Theo in July 1890. It lays bare the terrifying realization taking hold of his mind. My life, too, is attacked at the very root. My step also is faltering. His mental health was deteriorating so rapidly in those final weeks. The crushing despair that he would never be cured, that he was broken forever, was cementing itself permanently into his psyche.
So what finally drove him into the wheat field with a revolver? It was actually a devastating, misplaced sense of love. Vincent absolutely adored Theo's new baby boy, but the paranoia that he was draining the very money meant to feed his infant nephew became a psychological weight he just couldn't carry anymore. It wasn't just madness, it was this tragic, twisted sacrifice. And that brings us to the ultimate, devastating denouement of his life. In the early hours of July 29, 1890, Vincent van Gogh passed away. He was only 37 years old. After suffering for 2 agonizing days with the bullet lodged in his chest, his tormented mind finally gave out. Theo, who had rushed to his bedside and stayed with him right to the bitter end, wrote these absolutely shattering words to their mother. Completely broken, Theo watched the brother he had funded, protected, and loved so deeply finally succumb to the darkness. Vincent wanted to go. The fight was over.
The details of his funeral are almost unbearably poetic. They held it in the painter's room at the inn. His coffin just rested on simple carpenter's trestles. At his feet, they laid his palette and brushes. And surrounding his lifeless body were the very canvases he believed were worthless failures, literal masterpieces like the Church of Auvers and Irises. Barely 20 people attended, just a quiet, obscure end for a giant.
But then, the irony strikes almost immediately. The dirt was barely settled on his grave when letters began pouring in to Theo. One friend wrote, "He lives on for you, for us, in the works he left us." The art world was suddenly, finally waking up to what they had just lost. Thanks to the tireless brilliance of his sister-in-law, Jo Bonger, who took up the mantle after Theo tragically died just months later, the ultimate historical irony unfolded with breathtaking speed. Vincent died convinced he was a failure. Literally weeks later, his fame ignited in Paris. By the 1900s, the entire world was crowning him a historical genius. He sacrificed everything, his sanity, his physical health, and ultimately his life, for a legacy he never even got a glimpse of. He died utterly convinced his life's work was a disastrous burden. And honestly, it brutally dismantles that romanticized myth of the starving artist, showing us the grim, unvarnished reality of mental illness and unrequited ambition. So I want to leave you with this one haunting question. If absolute genius requires absolute destruction, was Vincent van Gogh's magnificent, tormenting vision a miracle, or was it a curse? It's a question that echoes through every single swirling brushstroke he left behind. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning the narratives, and I'll catch you next time.